Hello there, and welcome to the Get French Football News preview show. I'm Nathan Staples, and joining me this evening are Adam White and our newest addition to our preview show team, Bleacher Report's Samuel Rooke. Welcome to you both. It was another night of disappointment on Tuesday as Nice were dumped from the Champions League after a 2-0 defeat at home to Napoli. The Italians won 4-0 on aggregate with a performance that did not particularly please manager Lucien Favre. We'll have more on that in a moment. The other two clubs involved in that competition saw their groups drawn earlier today, with Paris Saint-Germain drawing Bundesliga champions Bayern Munich, Belgian side Anderlecht and Scottish giants Celtic, while Monaco are up against Portuguese opposition in Porto, Turkish Super League winners Besiktas, and the new German side on the block, RB Leipzig. And Marseille comfortably saw themselves into the Europa League draw with a 3-0 win at home to Domzale, thanks to a brace from Valère-Germain and an acrobatic late effort from Florian Thauvin. Loan will discover their group opponents in the draw tomorrow. We start tonight with Nice, who again disappointed in Europe. It'll be the Europa League again for them this season, Adam, but it was another tale of poor execution, might be the way of putting it. Again, they never really seemed to create much. Balotelli and Schneider both struggled. Favre was furious after the game as well with the spat about the Italian not working hard enough and issues with his bracelet. Again, it was a strange affair. This Nice team, even in Ligue 1 as well, doesn't seem to be clicking at the moment, and it almost feels like that Champions League campaign, Adam, that whole season where they've succeeded so well, feels a little bit of a throwaway waste now, doesn't it?
It does a little bit. I definitely think that this is a disappointment not getting into the group stages. But I think if you look at Nice as a team and you look at the team they've built and the players that they have, they've got some very, very good players. But I'm not sure they're quite ready for the Champions League group stages just yet. I know that they've obviously had a lot of overhaul in the summer and your players have left, which is something Lucien Favre has highlighted. And they could yet lose Seri in the last week of the transfer window, which is obviously be a big blow to them. And Cyprien's been injured. He was obviously out yesterday, been out since March, which is obviously a big miss as well. But as a club, I think they're just on the precipice of being ready for the Champions League. So having drawn Napoli, having had a good win against Ajax, I don't think it's too much of a disappointment. It's obviously disappointing, but it's not too much of a shame that they haven't qualified, because they probably wouldn't have expected to beat Napoli, and I don't know many people would have expected to beat Napoli. I think the Champions League would be a worse place this season without Napoli in the group stages. They're a fantastic team. They could well win Serie A this season with Juventus, a little bit weakened compared to previous years, perhaps. And they were the favourites for this tie, and they were brilliant yesterday. They dominated, really, absolutely dominated. Yes, Nice perhaps didn't execute as well as Lucien Favre would have hoped. Mario Balotelli, although he put on his Twitter account saying they were going to win 3-0, looked pretty confident as always at that point, but he did look his usual kind of slightly disinterested self, which is a little bit disappointing because that really hasn't been the case for him on the whole, at least so far. I think he's looked far more committed than you would expect from Balotelli, which is disappointing. Something I perhaps wanted to highlight here as well is Alan Saint-Maxim. I was a little bit disappointed in some of his passing yesterday. It was a bit wayward. He made a lot of wrong decisions and overhit balls a little bit. Although his pace really did cause trouble on the flanks. And I think that's kind of summed these up a little bit. They've got a lot of talent, they've got a lot of good players, but perhaps the street smarts weren't quite there yet. And if they can put another good season together, I don't know that they'll finish third. They could come close. They're in that shout, in that race, definitely. And perhaps next season they might be a little bit more in tune with the Champions League and perhaps could go well in the Europa League. But not a huge disappointment, but perhaps not quite ready just yet, unfortunately, for Nice.
Yeah, and it's not too much of a shame going out to such a talented side. But
absolutely, yeah.
Sam, they've focused on a lot of sort of big name players in the summer, and one of the big ones that they've re-signed at least is that man Adams mentioned, Balotelli, and Favre was pretty scathing in his criticism after the game, saying he wasn't in the game, the bracelet incident that everyone's already brought up, where he was off the pitch to cover it, and he even admitted that he should have brought him off sooner and that a no-name player really changed the game for them in many ways. Is the re-signing of the Italian to a new deal a mistake in hindsight?
I don't think it is, no. He's still one of the best players that Nice have when he plays at his best. And obviously, with Balotelli, there are always the caveats. He won't always be at his best. He often won't be at his best. But when he is an exceptional football player. He's, at his best, one of the better players in this league. He scored 17 goals last season, more than any other player in the team. Yeah, a lot of them are penalties, but you've still got to convert those. And he's a leader on the pitch. He's not necessarily the character of a leader, but he's a leader on the pitch, and he does something different. And even against Napoli, where he was very much below par, not fit probably as well, you could still see in little moments the quality that he does have. Little touches, little tiny moments where you can see the quality that Balotelli brings to the team. And once he's fit properly again, he's played 25 minutes in the last few weeks, and then he starts in a must-win game, dire situation, 2-0 down against one of the best teams in Europe. Tough for anyone. Once he gets fit again and Nice themselves get up and running, he'll contribute just like he did last season. And another thing that's probably worth considering, they signed Wesley Sneijder not entirely due to the fact that Balotelli's there, but the two of them, former friends, former teammates at Inter, you've got to imagine that helped grease the wheels of that signing. That was a real shock signing, Sneijder joining Nice, and you've got to imagine that Balotelli's presence helped that happen.
And it was an interesting transfer when you think that Yunus Belhanda is probably the one that's replaced the Dutchman at Galatasaray. It's a really interesting one, but hopefully that it can sort of mould together, especially if Seri ends up going. I do worry a little bit about Nice, especially defensively. They were not great again at times, but Napoli is so good going forward. Let's shift gears to the other teams in Champions League action, and the group stages were drawn earlier today. We'll start with the Paris Saint-Germain group, Adam, and I want to get your thoughts on this. They were drawn with Munich. They've got Anderlecht and Celtic in that group as well. Other than the Germans, which will be a cracking couple of ties, this should be a group they should definitely be getting out of, isn't it?
It is, especially with the obvious strengthenings they've made to their team and could yet do before the end of the transfer window. You'd expect them to make it out of this group. I think going to Celtic Park is going to be a very difficult game, and it always is for the bigger sides when they go to Celtic Park. They always make a good fist of those home games. So I have a feeling that who wins this group will come down to those two away trips to Celtic or to Anderlecht, and who out of Bayern Munich and PSG loses some of the less points, or perhaps puts on the best performances, perhaps even on goal difference, if the games between those two teams are draws, which they could well be. But I don't think it's as easy as perhaps you might be perceived. I think Anderlecht are a decent enough team. I know that last time PSG went there, they I think they smashed them 4-0. I seem to Zlatan Ibrahimovic scoring a ridiculous goal at Anderlecht. But as I mentioned, the Celtic game will be a difficult one. And I think if you look, I know they've lost Yuri Tielemans at Anderlecht. You look at their team, and Leander Den Donk has been very, very good for the last sort of 18 months or so. Sofian Hani's a good player as well. They've got Sven Kums as well, who's coming from Bruges, I think, or Ghent perhaps. Udinese, my apologies. So they've got one or two good players, and they could cause PSG trouble in Belgium. But given the strengthening they've made for their team, you'd expect PSG and Bayern to breeze through this group, I think. But it'd be interesting to see how they handle those two away trips, which could be awkward to start with at least.
Yeah, and some PSG and Munich are the headlines of this group. But do you think this is a group that Paris should be looking to win? I mean, there's many feelings in sort of the Bundesliga that Munich aren't quite the team they were a couple of years ago under Pep Guardiola. They're not quite the machine cranking out wins so easily. I mean, they conceded quite a fair few chances to Leverkusen at the weekend, although they did run out successful. Is this quite a chance for PSG to not only top a group, but get one over one of those big European teams as well at the same time?
It definitely is. This is definitely a group that PSG should be trying to win. The signings that they've made, obviously headlined by that man Neymar, are driven directly at winning the Champions League. That's what they're there to do. This Bayern team, as you mentioned, they're not quite a wounded animal, but they are not firing at all cylinders. They've not necessarily improved since last season. They've made signings of young, promising players, but James Rodriguez apart, have they improved their starting 11? Probably not. They're still reliant on these aging stars, Robben, Ribéry, and PSG need a statement in Europe. They should have topped the group last season. They made a real mistake. They're ceding that to Arsenal on the final day. this needs to be a statement from them to really make the point that they've signed Neymar and now they're serious in Europe.
It's going to be a really interesting one when those two meet. Adam, let's move on to Monaco's group. And this is really interesting, really. A mix of sides that all will feel that they can get out of it. It's Porto, Besiktas and RB Leipzig. There's not an easy game in there. There's not a particularly ridiculously difficult game in there. Is this still a group that Monaco should be topping?
I think they'll definitely be aiming to. But then, as you said, I think, all four of those sides could theoretically top this group, and it's a very, very even group. It's a group I really like, actually. There are one or two of these groups in the Champions League. The way the seedings work out with the top 8, or the top 8 seeds, if you like, the pot 1 of seeds all being the top 8 coefficient leagues champions. The second pool of seeds was almost stronger than the first, which was interesting, and it kind of made the draw a little bit more uneven, perhaps. And you've got a few groups where it's very, very even, and you could see any of those 4 teams finishing anywhere in that group. And I think Monaco's group is definitely one. It'd be really interesting to see how RB Leipzig adapts to the Champions League, assuming Naby Keita stays, which I imagine he will. They could be a bit of a dark horse in this group, given they did so well in the Bundesliga last year, finishing second, I think, in the end, didn't they? Dortmund third. Besiktas is always a very, very difficult place to go. I mean, they were definitely the best team in Turkey last season, deservedly winning that title. And Porto, obviously Champions League regulars in the knockout stages. They haven't been quite as good recently. Benfica are the dominant force in Portugal as it stands, but going to the Dragao is never easy. So I think depending on how Monaco it almost depends on how much Monaco, what their team looks like at the end of the transfer window. Because obviously there's been a lot of things about Mbappe and Fabinho, who are currently, in my opinion, their 2 best players, leaving to go to PSG. If they do both leave and they don't replace them adequately, which Monaco aren't necessarily... don't have a proclivity to spending big sums of money to replace the 2 very, very difficult to replace players. Perhaps Fabinho is a bit more replaceable than Mbappe. Then they might find themselves at a little bit of a disadvantage going into the Champions League, into the Champions League group stages, and it may not in the end, if it works out that way, a group that they get out of. I think for now they will, but to say it's possible for them to top it, but to say they're favourites would be a little bit of a misnomer, I think, because it's such a tight group, and I think that they perhaps might not have the firepower that they would have hoped. But then, having said that, it's difficult to overlook players like Falcao and Thomas Lemar, and Leonardo Jardim's been very, very sort of streetwise in the Champions League and in Ligue and over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. So they've still got a lot of weapons there, but I think a lot of it's going to depend on how their team changes between now and that first group game. And if they are unable to rectify possible levers, then they could be in trouble. I can honestly see them slipping into the Europa League.
Sam, what do you think to this group? I mean, we've mentioned how close it is, but the positive of that is that teams might end up beating each other and make it almost wide open for one team that does get those results to get through. Is this, again, a group that you still, even with the closest of it, expect Monaco to qualify through?
Yeah, I think Adam's made some very good points about just how close and how competitive this group is. There is advantages to that, as you say, in that this could be a group where something like 9 points is enough to just sneak through. But there are no easy games. There's a disadvantage in that Monaco's first game is away at Leipzig, Leipzig's first Champions League game. That team will be up for that game. That's not going to be a game that is going to be an easy one. The double-header in the middle of the fixtures, Besiktas, again, they were a strong team last season who have strengthened in the off-season. They've brought in a lot of new players with a hilarious transfer video that they keep using. This is going to be a very, very challenging group. Yes, they should be still aiming to get out. But again, as Adam points out, the transfer window will really define their aspirations this season if things go as badly as they could go. If Fabinho and Mbappe depart and there aren't replacements signed, or at least not adequate ones, then this is going to be an awfully difficult group, and the Europa League might be their destiny. Equally, if some of the rumours do shake out, I mean, Kasper Dolberg is one that's been rumoured. Ajax have just dropped out of the Europa League this evening. That's going to make that transfer a little bit more likely. Perhaps Dolberg is capable of replacing Mbappe's excitement and Mbappe's goals. Then Monaco are perhaps up and away again. But it really just depends on what happens in the next 7 days of this transfer window.
Yeah, and the Dane was on the bench for Ajax at the weekend as well. So the plot thickens there, maybe, possibly, if Mbappe goes. But I'll tell you what, the Europa League won't be looking forward to whoever drops out of that group either. They're going to be really competitive. On to Marseille this evening as well, and they won 3-0 relatively comfortable, really. Domzale caused some problems in the first half, but a relatively comfortable afternoon in the second half, especially with Germain scoring twice. He set up the third as well for Florent Thauvin. And if you've not seen it yet, you do need to catch it. It's a nice, lovely little overhead quick. Not quite on that calibre of the Kazawa one at the weekend, but that's still good enough at all. But I do want to present this one to both of you because this is one of those interesting questions for the Europa League now, given that you can get Champions League automatic qualification from winning it. I'll throw it to you first, Sam. Do you think Marseille have a chance of winning the Europa League this season? There is a couple of difficult sides in there, the likes of Arsenal. There's always a couple of difficult German sides. Anyone who drops from the Champions League will add to that quality. But they have a chance?
There's always a chance. Certainly. I mean, Marseille have bought squad depth this summer, which is something they didn't have in the past. Their starting 11 is very good. It's very strong. When all their players are fit and they can pick from their best 11, they can match it with most sides. Arsenal will be very difficult to beat, but Arsenal have often found ways of beating themselves in Europe. So that may be a way for Marseille to just cruise on through. They can definitely aspire to win this trophy, but I think their focus will be on Ligue, and often with the Europa League, it comes down to just what your focus is. Big teams, particularly big English teams, often take their eye off the ball and find that Europe's quite challenging, even in the Europa League, and the same could happen to Marseille. But if they focus on it and they finish the transfer window strongly, they have the right players fit, ready to go, certainly they can aspire to at least challenge in the Europa League.
What do you think? I'm just looking down the list of some of the teams that are already in there that aren't dropping from the Champions League. Obviously, we won't know that for a while, but Arsenal, Lyon, Villarreal, Lazio. We've got Real Sociedad in there, Lokomotiv Moscow, Hoffenheim, Cologne, Nice obviously dropped down, Hertha Berlin. There's a few decent sides in there. AC Milan qualified this evening as well. Can they aspire to push and try and win this competition? Because it is such a big prize at the end for those, especially in those teams, like we say, there's only 3 that can make it in Liga, and even then the third team has to go through several qualifiers. It should be a big motivation, surely.
I think that's a very good point. I think it definitely will be a motivation for them. But to win this competition is going to be extremely difficult this year, partly because of the makeup of the Champions League draw. The sides dropping in to the Europa League in the knockout stages from those third place Champions League the groups and the third place in Champions League groups, my apologies, will be very, very good teams on some occasions, because there are a number of groups with 3 strong teams. And we talked about, you think about sort of Spurs group and a number of others, that you could end up with 2 or 3 real heavyweights dropping in from the Champions League, which I think is going to make this competition very, very difficult to win this year, partly because of that. It's almost a knock-on effect of the Champions League draw and the way the seeds were rejigged last season. It's kind of worked out that there's 3 good teams in one group and one of them will drop in. Added to that, you mentioned Arsenal, Lyon, Villarreal, Bilbao, Lazio, Milan. There's still some very, very good teams. And at the moment, I mentioned that Nice perhaps aren't at the right stage in their development to really push on in the Champions League. I think Marseille are in a similar position in that, yes, they signed some good players, some experienced players as well, which does give them, gives them a slightly different feel to Nice, who is perhaps a bit more raw than Marseille. But with Adel Rami coming in, obviously Evra and Bellegerman, they're more experienced players and they're more used to European competition. But even so, I think they're still a little bit in a stage of a development where they're not at the level where they're going to, on a consistent basis, challenge those teams. And you could end up with a quarterfinals with 8 very, very good sides in, of which Marseille might be if they get that far, of course, might be sort of the weakest of. And I think that's probably relatively likely. So I think for Marseille, I wouldn't necessarily saying prioritise Ligue, but it might be worth sort of keeping both on a level playing field and not really looking to really expecting to win or to get somewhere in this competition, because it would be very, very difficult, and use it as a learning experience for perhaps next season or even further down the line. The only issue with that is that their squad, the players who have 14 experience, are relatively aging. They've got a relatively aging team. It's all the sort of old French international. It's sort of Evra's 36 now, Rami's into his 30s as well. There's a couple of other players in there too who aren't young anymore. So there's sort of a bit of a double-edged sword in that respect. But from where I'm standing, I don't think they're necessarily capable of winning this competition. And even in the group stages, they could end up with something like Arsenal, Hoffenheim, and Istanbul, who've put together a good team as well, which would be, you'd even struggle to get out of that group. So I think there's a long way to go in this competition, but the sides are dropping from the Champions League are likely to be very close, if not very likely to win this competition. So Marseille, not this season. I think they need to keep building, and perhaps they can use it as a good learning experience, and perhaps get into the knockout stage and help the French coefficient. But I don't see them winning it.
Yeah, it could be a really interesting group stage of the Europa League. And like I say, when it gets further down the line, it's getting a much, much better competition than it has been in previous years, at least. But let's move our attention back to Ligue 1 matters and a couple of previews for them. We'll start with the Paris Saint-Germain Saint-Etienne game on Friday night, Adam. Saint-Etienne are off to an unbeaten start for their first time since they won the title back in 1980-81 season, if you could believe that. Yeah, I know it's a great stat. How much have they improved under Garcia, and can they pose a challenge to PSG on Friday night? Could they be their first real competitive game for Neymar?
I think it could be. If they can pose a challenge to PSG, I think that they'll be stubborn, at least. I think Garcia set them up in a very almost mirroring Gautier a little bit, in that they're very hard to beat, they're very stubborn, they're very defensively solid, and they don't necessarily commit too many men forward, and they haven't conceded yet, which kind of says a lot. 1 or 3 games. Beating Nice on the opening day was obviously a great result. So that that was a relatively competitive game. But going to the Parc des Princes is obviously compared to pretty much everybody in the league, and any team going there is going to be a bit of a step up. So I think that yes, this will be their sort of a test of a certain level that they won't receive anybody anywhere else apart from PSG this season. So it'll be interesting to see how they deal with that. But I think for Saint-Etienne, they've always had effective players, and Gautier has always managed to get the best out of them. You talk about players in sort of that midfield. I've always say they're very, very uninspiring, but they do a job. And I think that the main thing for Saint-Etienne this season, with Oscar Garcia coming in, is that Saint-Etienne needed a refresh. It become stale under Gautier. He'd been 9 years at the club, and he'd been doing the same thing pretty much with limited resources, not being able to develop his team, and it would become stale. And I think the fact that Oscar Garcia's come in, slightly new way of doing things, not necessarily wholly different ideas, but it's sort of given the players a little bit of a refresh and a bit of a kick out the backside a little bit. They've sort of redoubled their efforts a little bit, and I think that's been the main issue for them this season. It's been the main sort of driving force, that they look like they sort of recovered from the malaise that settled in under Gautier, which has nothing to do with necessarily the manager. I think it was just sort of a necessary, well, not necessary, but a likely outcome of that long spell without much change. And they look sort of refreshed this season. And you look at their midfield, and you look at Brian Darby, the way he's come in and performed pretty well. Ola Senas has done okay, despite being pretty average under Gautier. Assane Diussi, who's coming from Empoli, has played really well in the first few games. Hamuma looks sort of rejuvenated and signed a new contract recently. So I think it's just that they've had that change, and they sort of got just grew a bit sort of boring under Gautier, and it all became a bit of the same. And I think the players felt that. So whether Garcia has made any drastic changes is open to debate. I personally don't think he has. But Saint-Etienne have good players, and they haven't had to struggle with the Europa League this season, which has been a huge burden on them in previous years. So that's helped as well. So I think it's been evolution rather than revolution under Garcia, and it'll be interesting to see how that new team adapts to his new formation of the team adapts at the Parc des Princes tomorrow. But if they come away with another clean sheet, I'll be very surprised.
Sam, PSG are also unbeaten so far, unsurprisingly, but with rumours of another big name potentially coming in, Mbappe. We don't fully know yet, but it might happen. Will this game determine some of those who might find the exit door sooner rather than later, with it being the last game before the last game before the window shuts as well? Are some of these players probably fighting for their PSG careers?
I think they are, and I think we'll see a lot just from the lineup. Unai Emery has not been awfully transparent about whose place is under threat, which is fair enough. But Julian Draxler, for example, has been one that's been heavily linked with an exit. His agent spoke to the German press today and said absolutely not, no chance. But agents say things, so we can't really take that at any more than that. If he doesn't get a start again, you might think that perhaps it's Draxler's time is up in Paris already. But equally, there are so many players who are looking at very limited time. Will players like Lo Celso, Guedes, will they get anywhere near an appearance against Saint-Etienne, or is their time perhaps up as well? Will they be perhaps even included in the Mbappe deal? That's one of the rumours that's been going around, is that Jardim is a great admirer of Guedes and wants him in exchange. We just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and there's rumours that Guedes might be going on loan to Valencia as well, but they don't seem to have fully materialised yet. But it'd be interesting to see who ends up in the squad and doesn't from when Mbappe maybe possibly could be coming in. Let's move on to... I'll get your predictions, actually, before we move on. I'll start with you, Adam. What's your prediction in this one?
3-0 PSG.
Sam?
I think 3-1.
I'm going for a 2-1. I'm going to be a little bit kinder on Saint-Etienne. I think Paris Saint-Germain just have a little bit too much, but this will be definitely a better test for them than it has been in the last couple of weeks, at least anyway. Let's move on to Nantes Lyon. And Adam, not finally got off the mark in a scrappy win last week against Troyes, but does Ranieri need to show us something different from this bare bones squad against a better side like Lyon to stave away those worries of maybe possibly being in that lower mid-table, possibly even a relegation fight?
Perhaps. I was so happy that they got their win at Troyes last week, down to 10 men, and they stuck that 1-0 win. Emiliano Sala was very, very good again, and he's really come to the fore in the last sort of year or so under Conceição and now Ranieri to some extent as well, although it be a very sort of fledgling reign for Ranieri. I think that for now, Ranieri just has to kind of struggle through with Nantes. They've obviously got a very depleted squad. They're suffering really terribly with injuries. Losing Guillaume Gillet to Olympiacos over the summer was a massive blow. He was such a leader for them, given how young some parts of their team are. Such an experienced head and a very, very good player in this league, and for a club like Nantes, losing him is very, very difficult to replace. They've had to sort of scratch around a little bit for transfers. They've missed out on so many targets. And they've sort of developed this sort of eclectic group of players coming in, like Giroto coming from Brazil, a couple of guys from Belgium, El Ganassi and Koulibaly coming from Belgium, Paulois from Bordeaux. I'm not entirely convinced about his form since joining and towards the end of last season for Bordeaux too. So it's almost like they just have to kind of grin and bear it for now. And he needs to he's going to need time with his team. It's going to take him a while to sort of, for a first 11 to really coalesce, but especially once his transfer window is open, he can see where he's at. Maybe Produce Nakuma will leave too. I know that he's not necessarily in Ranieri's good books at the moment, and he can kind of mould a team from there. So I think that expectations for the Nantes fans, unfortunately, are going to have to be scaled back a little bit. Because I imagine when they signed Ranieri at the end of during the summer, and with the way that things happened at Leicester, they had high hopes, and I think that they won't be in a relegation battle, but they're going to have to sort of expect a mid-table finish, and if they can finish in the top half, they would have done really, really well. And I think if Ranieri's got a 2-year deal, I think, which is surprisingly short, so next season might be the season that they perhaps they sort of find a way to put a team together and really start to gel, and they might be looking in slightly more medium to longer term in terms of getting those performances that they had under Conceição back. So I'm glad that they got their win last week, and it was well deserved, and they played well, and I'd like to see Ranieri do well, but I think it's going to take time to sort of chisel out a team from this squad, which is a little bit sort of disparate at the moment. There's a lot of sort of factors that are affecting his team selection. So it'd be an interesting game at the weekend, see how they get on, but I think mid-table this season, and maybe it's a slower process than perhaps they would have hoped.
Sam, Lyon have been nothing short of entertaining really so far this season, but these are the kind of games that they really need to put teams to the sword to if they want to qualify for the Champions League, surely, isn't it?
Absolutely. If they win this game, this will be their best start to a season in years. They often drop silly points at the start of the season, but this is a fixture they won last year 6-0. So they have experience in putting Nantes to the sword, and it's something they have to do, because if they want to keep pace with the teams at the top, if they want to threaten for a Champions League place, or even if they want to be comfortably a Europa League side and then devote some of their resources to a Europa League campaign this season, they need to win these games early, get points on the board, and really establish themselves as an upper echelon side. Dropping points in a game like this against a depleted, unformed Nantes side would be a real shame, given how strongly they've started. They've been, as you say, nothing short of entertaining, but they may need to show a little bit of grit, because that's the one thing this Nantes side do seem to have.
And that's a worry, especially, like I say, when they went a man down. They managed to keep it score down relatively well, but that Malcolm's pretty good for Bordeaux. I'll get your predictions now then, Sam. I'll go for you first.
I think 3-0.
To Lyon. I'm going to go with... I think 4-0 Lyon. I still really have real worry for Nantes. they just managed to get past Troyes last week, and they didn't look convincing at all. Adam?
2-1 Lyon. I think Nantes will put up a fight, but Lyon, for me, will win this game.
On to Toulouse-Rennes, which is on Saturday as well. Adam, Toulouse put up a semblance of a fight for a decent amount of the game against Paris Saint-Germain this week, but it's been a tough start to them facing them and the current champions. What can we expect from them against Rennes?
I think Toulouse look like they're capable of producing similar performances as they did at the start of last season. They've gone to, as you mentioned, to both Monaco and PSG already this season, and the reverse fixtures this time last year they won both of those games at the Stade Municipal in Toulouse, and I think that Dupraz has managed to, despite losing Martin Braithwaite, which given how he performed in the second half of the season is not a huge blow. I think they've actually improved in terms of their playing staff on the end of last season, with Max Gradel coming in, scored a really good goal to open his scoring at the Parc des Princes last year. I think Yannick Kouazak's a really interesting signing. Dupraz joked in his unveiling that he'd done well not to get sent off yet, which is very good. I hadn't even played at that point, but I think he's a very combative midfielder. Suits Dupraz's style, as Andy Delors did when he came in the summer. Dupraz made that point as well, that they kind of suit the way he plays. And I think they're going to be a very, very difficult side to beat, and I think they can score goals. He said that Dupraz said before the PSG game that perhaps they parked the bus. He said you could tell everyone we're going to park the bus. And then the team actually sort of set out was actually quite attacking, sort of 4-4-2 with two out-and-out wingers in Dermaz and Max Gradel. And I think that they've sort of managed to strike the balance between being difficult to beat, and I think they're capable of scoring goals. And I think there's a very definite top 7 this season, perhaps, of the 6 that finished in the top 6 last year, plus Lille. But beyond that, you could argue that Toulouse are perhaps one, along with one or two others, but they're in sort of contention to finish just outside that top 7. And I think they're going to be an exciting team to watch this year. We saw how they played against Monaco. They were not necessarily unlucky in that game, but they definitely, were definitely in the game for a long time, losing 3-2. And I think they're sort of an underappreciated aspect of Ligue, and obviously my love for Dupraz is no secret, but I think that we can expect a lot from the season. And I think if you get the chance to watch them, especially at home, they're quite a compelling team to watch on occasion. So I think they're an asset to the league and one that's not overly appreciated. So it'll be look forward to see how they get on, and I think they'll be beating a lot of sides this season, especially at home. It's going to be a very difficult place to go to. So I think a top half finish would be great, and a more power to Dupraz. He's taken that side from relegation certainties to a top half league and team possibly. So an interesting development story and one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, nice to see Issa Diop back at the weekend as well. They desperately need someone as good as him.
Absolutely.
And the back as well with Julian. Despite a strong summer, Sam, Rennes have really struggled at the start of the season and have yet to win in Liga. What needs to change, or do they still need to reinforcements if they want to be competing for Europe like we might have expected before the season started?
I think they remain a work in progress. There haven't been that many changes through the summer, but obviously the biggest deal, the signing of Ismail Sarr, potentially 30 million euro signing, he is the focus, and he's shown his brilliance in fits and starts so far. But Gourcuff is trying to do something with him. He's trying to convert him from this sort of wide attacker that he was at Metz. He's trying to turn him into a right down the middle centre forward, make him the focus of that team. And it's not quite working yet, but the green shoots are there, and I think this is a team that just needs time to bed in. These new signings, Mouassa, Bourigeaud, they've looked good in moments, but when they played Lyon, they were competitive. But they've just dropped off in key moments and shown that they lack the fluidity of a more settled side.
Yeah, it's been a little bit stuttering at the moment. I'll go with... Oh, this is a tough one. I think I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw in this one. Toulouse have been decent, but they've had 2 difficult games. Rennes haven't convinced me. I don't think they've got enough firepower. I mean, Moubele scored a double, and it's probably the luckiest double I've ever seen last week. Adam, what's your prediction?
I'm going to go 2-1 Toulouse.
Sam?
I'm going to go for a goalless draw.
No optimism there. We go to Sunday's big game, and that's between Monaco and Marseille, which could be a real humdinger, Adam. It's been 3 wins out of 3 again for Monaco, the only other unbeaten side in Ligue so far, despite the many rumours that still surround this squad. Can they still mount a title challenge this season? And if so, how vital is a win against a side like Marseille on Sunday night?
It's crucial, I think. First of all, can they still mount a title challenge? I think they're still the most likely team to be able to challenge PSG. But if PSG do take their two best players, it's going to become increasingly difficult, of course. But if they are to mount a title challenge, this is the type of game that they're going to have to win. I think it's possible, but again, it would be very, very difficult because the issue is that PSG are going to win the vast majority, if not, most of their game. So to keep pace with them, they're going to have to do the same. They might be a little less spectacular than PSG. They might not go and score as many goals as they did last season, but I still think they're very capable of beating it. They're still the second best team in this league, and I still fully expect them to be favourites of pretty much every other game apart from playing against PSG. So if they can keep pace somehow, they can keep eking out wins, then when it comes to the games between the two sides, in those one-off games, they're a very smart team. Leandro Jardin's a very, very smart coach. They can still get something from those games. I wouldn't put them as favourites, but I can still see them getting something from those games, which would put them in the realms of a title challenge, hopefully. So this is the type of game that they're going to be. It's sort of those very difficult games against that group of 7 teams that I mentioned, aside from PSG, that they would most struggle in, having lost some of their best players if they continue to do so. So winning this sort of game against Marseille and against Lyon and against Lille as well, Nice and Bordeaux, those sort of teams, is going to be their main issue. They're going to need to be winning those games because PSG are going to win those games too, and they're the type of games that Monaco are going to struggle the most in. So this type of game is going to be one that they'll be targeting to get 3 points from and keep pace with PSG. That's the only thing they can hope to do, is hang in there, hope that they can stay in touch and hopefully get something out of the games against PSG. So they still started relatively well. It's gone a little bit under the radar. Falcao's been very, very good in the first few games. So there's still hope for Monaco and the rest of Ligue and by extension. But this is the type of game that they're going to have to keep winning if they're going to stay in the title race.
And very important one. And Sam, Marseille stumbled at home against Angers last time out. If they want to reach the Champions League next season, do they need to be more clinical in games like that as well, or do they need to be a bit more defensively sound than they've shown in the first few opening games?
They are, again, a team that is still under construction. Rudy Garcia has a lot of new players and a real task to fit them together. Obviously, Germain has proved an excellent signing already. He looks great. But injuries to this team have slowed the progress. And G comes in, scores, gets injured, comes back, scores again, gets injured again. This is not ideal for a team that's trying to build practically a new side, and with new aspirations of pushing for the Champions League, they look a little bit far off that at this point, because they don't look clinical, as you say. They have the personnel to be defensively sound. In Luis Gustavo as a screening midfielder, that's as good as anyone outside of PSG and Monaco can put up. The back line, there was plenty of jokes when Adil Rami signed from people who perhaps don't appreciate the qualities he does have. He's certainly capable of being a leading defender in this league. He can help Marseille improve defensively because he is still a fine player, despite his aging. New players all over this team are slowing the progress, and they do need to become a lot more cohesive, a lot more clinical. They need to take their chances, because that was a game they could have won. They could have come into this game on equal footing with Monaco and been, early favourites to be the team to push PSG. They didn't. They stumbled, and now they're already looking up the table, and that's not an ideal place to be, and it's not a place they had to be.
Yeah, and it's the worry this evening that Adil Rami had to come off in the first half. There might be an injury worry for him for the next couple of weeks. And I did have to have a giggle at West Ham fans moaning about Dimitri Payet not making the French squad earlier today. He might have struggled when you're injured in sideline. It might be a bit difficult to run on the pitch. Adam, I'll get your prediction on this. What do you think for Sunday evening? 1-0
Monaco, I think.
Sam?
I'm going to go for an upset, 2-1 to Marseille.
I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw. I think Marseille maybe just rise their game in this kind of fixture that just about unsettles a Monaco side that were good last week, but I'm not convinced that everyone can keep their concentration solely on football at the moment. But we'll we'll wait and see how the week comes anyway. That's all for this week. My thanks to Adam, Sam, and all of you listening in at home. Join us for our regular reactions from our main show on Monday. But for now, enjoy your weekend of football.